I arrived at the site just after dawn, the pale light filtering through the dense canopy of the Smoky Mountains. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine needles, oak leaves, and heavy ground, a rich, musky smell that clung to everything. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a tangled maze of towering oak, hemlock, and rhododendron thick enough to swallow any path whole. My truck sat at the edge of a narrow dirt road, its tires already caked with mud from yesterday's rain, but it was as close as we could get without disturbing the fragile ground further. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the chill settling in my bones despite the steady climb in temperature forecast for the day. Setting up the survey grid was the first order of business. I pulled the GPS unit from my pack, flicking it on with practiced ease, and began marking coordinates for our excavation squares. The process was methodical and exacting, no room for guesswork here. We were mapping the site with precision, cataloging every shard, tool fragment, and fire pit we uncovered. Years of training had taught me to move slowly, to observe carefully. The past had a way of hiding in plain sight, and missing a single clue could mean losing a piece of the story forever. Jake, my partner, was already at work clearing the undergrowth a few meters away, his voice cutting through the quiet with a sarcastic quip about cursed pipes and haunted artifacts. I smiled faintly, grateful for his humor. It was the kind of thing that made the long days bearable in places like this, isolated and far from anything resembling civilization. Still, even his easy confidence didn't quite erase the edge of unease that had settled over me since we arrived. There was something subtle in the air, something just out of reach. Around mid-morning, we uncovered the stone ring. It was partially buried beneath a thin layer of soil and moss, the stones arranged in a rough circle, their surfaces worn smooth by time. The ring's symmetry suggested deliberate design, a ceremonial purpose rather than something purely functional. I ran my gloved hand over one of the stones, feeling the cold, hard surface beneath my fingers. The air seemed to shift as I did, the wind falling silent for a moment, and a distant bird call ceased abruptly. Jake noticed too, his usual light-hearted banter faltering as he looked around. Later, a group of local Cherokee elders visited the site. They moved with a quiet grace, their presence commanding respect without a word. One of the women, her eyes sharp and clear, spoke softly about a local legend, the cold voice in the woods, a warning passed down through generations. She described it as a whisper among the trees, a voice that mimics those you trust, calling you deeper into the forest where you may never return. Jake rolled his eyes at the story, dismissing it as superstition, but I found myself listening closely, my skepticism wavering ever so slightly. The day passed with routine tasks, soil samples collected, GPS points double-checked, artifacts bagged and labeled. But beneath the surface, the forest seemed to hold its breath. At one point, Jake claimed he heard his name whispered from the trees, but when I asked, he couldn't say who called or from where. I chalked it up to the wind or an overactive imagination, yet a knot of unease tightened in my gut. As dusk fell, the temperature dropped sharply and a thick fog began to roll in, softening the edges of the trees and muting the sounds of the forest. Suddenly, a deer darted from the underbrush, its hooves pounding the soft earth as it fled without warning. Jake and I both jumped, startled by the sudden movement. The animal disappeared quickly into the gathering twilight, leaving only the sound of its retreating footsteps. That night, I lay awake in my tent, the sounds of the forest muted except for the occasional rustle of leaves. My thoughts circled back to the elder's warning and the day's strange moments. The shadows beyond the tent seemed deeper, more crowded. Outside, the cold wind whispered through the trees, carrying voices I could almost make out, but never fully hear. Somewhere, a distant call echoed, or was it just the imagination? Before drifting off, I thought I heard a quiet voice say my name. Alex. It seemed to murmur, soft and far away. I turned onto my side and stared into the darkness, wondering what secrets this ancient mountain still held, and whether we were about to uncover something better left forgotten. By the third day, the ground was changing. Not in the way that soil layers shift or compact over time, This felt deeper, almost intentional, like the land itself had been arranged to hide something and had grown weary of keeping the secret. We expanded the grid southward, fanning out from the ceremonial stone ring we'd uncovered earlier in the week. The spacing between the outermost stones grew wider and less regular, as if we'd crossed some kind of unseen threshold. Whatever was buried here, it hadn't been designed to be discovered easily. The rain was steady and mean-spirited, soaking through jackets and tents alike, pooling in every corner of the site. The air took on the dense, metallic smell of disturbed earth and cold roots, and everything, the trees, the moss, even the mist itself, felt stiller than before, like the woods were holding their breath. Jake had uncovered a series of stone slabs beneath a pocket of shallow soil. They were heavy and roughly carved, stacked in overlapping layers that sloped along the hillside. At first, they looked like some kind of primitive retaining wall, but as we brushed them clean, the etchings became visible, tightly curled lines that looped into themselves, like vines or sinew. The largest slab featured a wide spiral that narrowed to a sharp, closed center, the same clenched mouth pattern we'd seen on the central altar days before. Some of the surrounding stones bore imagery that shimmered oddly when caught at an angle. One shape resembled a circle of hollow eyes, or perhaps sockets, all radiating outward like a wheel. The longer I looked at it, the more my mind tried to reshape it into something familiar, but nothing ever quite settled. The markings didn't resemble a written system or ornamental design. They felt more instinctive, like a visual chant or rhythm carved into stone instead of spoken aloud. The pattern of the carvings pulled the eye downward along the slope, always in the same direction, like they were meant to guide or bind something below. A small pouch of bone fragments turned up just beneath the stones, not scattered like trash or residue, but deliberately packed into a tight bundle and fused with clay. Next came a carved shard of blackened wood, about the length of my forearm, shaped roughly like a flat plank or sign. Its surface was warped and bubbled from age and moisture, but beneath the grime, I could see a pattern burned into it, not tribal iconography, but something crude and erratic, almost angry. The ends were splintered as if it had once been attached to something larger. I tagged and bagged it like anything else, but there was a moment when I lifted it from the soil that I felt an odd resistance, like the surrounding earth had been holding it tight. Jake, working a few meters downhill, called out softly. He didn't raise his voice, just motioned with one hand and crouched beside a narrow trench he'd started. I walked over and saw the edge of a bone exposed in the mud, curved and clean. I guessed animal at first. But as I cleared more soil, the shape shifted into something unmistakable. A jaw fragment. Then a femur, still partly encased in clay. They were human. We both went quiet. More bones emerged, mixed and overlapping, some broken, others worn smooth. A few were darkened unnaturally, as if burned before burial. We expanded the trench cautiously, and soon the pit took shape, a deliberate cavity beneath the stone formation, layered with skeletal remains. Unlike Cherokee burial layouts I'd studied, which were typically arranged with ceremonial orientation, these were clustered and uneven. Shoved together. A foul layer of dark soil ran through the center of the cavity, almost like a bruise in the earth. Mixed into it were shards of pottery and what looked like melted glass, too primitive for bottles, too malformed for tools. It didn't belong. And I knew, even before we finished exposing the central area, that this hadn't been a peaceful grave. It was something else. We covered what we could with a tarp and marked the site perimeter with bright orange tape. As I logged the find in our master notebook, I noticed something strange. A spiral symbol, like the one on the slabs, had been lightly drawn in pencil on the corner of the site map. It wasn't part of any grid square, and I hadn't marked it. I asked Jake if he'd added it, and he shook his head slowly. He looked tired. Distant. His movements had grown slower that day, like he was constantly listening to something just beneath the ambient noise. The GPS log had started acting up again. Coordinates saved from the burial site reset twice while I was checking catalog entries. A few of the bone tags we documented were no longer showing up in the archive. It wasn't a software issue. Files were gone. Like they'd never been entered. Later that night, fog rolled in from the valley. Thicker than before. It coiled low to the ground and clung to the edges of our camp, muting the usual forest sounds. Not a single bird call. The underbrush stayed still. Even the wind seemed to hold back. Inside the tent, I flipped through our field photos, scanning for clearer images of the burial pit. Several had come out distorted. Some blurred at the edges, others stretched vertically as though the lens had been dragged during the exposure. One photo, taken of the central slab, had a dark smudge in the background, tall, faintly angular, right at the edge of the fog line. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of something standing still. I closed the laptop and sat for a while in silence. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard a sharp knock, 3 short beats. Then nothing. The wind didn't return. The fog just pressed inward, slow and quiet. The next morning, the tarp we'd secured over the burial pit had been disturbed. Not pulled off or torn, just slightly shifted, the corner weights nudged aside as if someone had carefully peeled it back. No signs of animals. No tracks. Jake didn't comment. He just reset the tarp and went back to work. I knelt near the wooden relic we'd found earlier, still sealed in its sample bag, and stared at the carved surface. Whatever it was, it didn't belong with the rest of the site's artifacts. It was too raw. Too recent, in a way that didn't make sense. And I hadn't noticed until then, but the bag was wet from the inside, as if moisture had gathered around the object and refused to leave. We didn't speak much the rest of that day. The air stayed still. The trees watched. And the spiral on the map had grown darker. The storm did not ease. It gathered force through the night, turning the trees into towering silhouettes bowed by wind and rain. Water hissed against the tent's fabric, and every gust pressed the cold deeper into my bones. The fog that had started creeping in the night before thickened into a shifting wall, swirling low over the forest floor and swallowing every familiar shape. Visibility dropped until the site felt like an island suspended in a sea of mist and wet. Electrical devices were the first to betray us. The radios sputtered with static, then went silent. The GPS units blinked erratically, saved waypoints vanished like they'd never existed. I checked my phone for a signal, nothing but dead air. The storm was severing us from the outside world, isolating us more completely than the mountain ever could alone. Jake woke early, his face drawn and pale beneath the hood of his jacket. He told me the SUV's alternator had probably died, or the battery was drained. The storm was too rough for the generator, and without the vehicle running, we'd lose our only real connection off the mountain. He said he'd hike back down the trailhead to inspect and fix it, maybe swap batteries or find a better signal for the radio. He left without packing much more than a small backpack and a flashlight. His boots vanished quickly into the rain-slicked dirt trail, swallowed by the thickening woods. Hours passed. The rain and wind thrashed on relentlessly, and I watched the fog twist and curl around the tents, draping everything in wet silence. I kept checking the edge of the tree line for a glimpse of Jake's figure, but the storm swallowed sound and sight alike. I told myself he was fine, he knew the path better than I did. But as daylight waned and the forest fell quiet, a gnawing worry took root. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the gloom. The wet mud sucked at my boots, making every step heavier. My voice felt small and cracked as I called out Jake's name, but no answer came. The trees pressed inward, and the fog clung to every branch and leaf like cold breath. It was then I saw it, Jake's scarf, bright against the dull gray of the wet bark. Tied in a loose knot, high on a branch where no animal could have reached. It swung slowly in the wind, wet and stained, like a warning left for me to find. I pulled it down and held it in my hands, the fabric heavy and damp. No other sign of him followed. Footprints tracked through the mud. I knelt to inspect them, rough, human, but incomplete. They stopped mid-step, as if whoever made them had vanished into the air. I scanned the area around me but found no other tracks, no animal disturbance, no broken twigs. The silence was unnerving, unnatural. I swallowed hard and returned to camp, senses on edge. As the last light disappeared behind the hills, I saw a figure emerge from the fog, Jake's shape, unmistakable in its wet jacket and worn boots. Relief surged, but it faded quickly. Something was wrong. The way he moved was too rigid, too calculated. His eyes were distant, almost vacant. He asked the same questions I'd answered hours before, repeating phrases without hesitation. His voice matched Jake's, but it felt slightly delayed, out of sync with his lips. I watched him carefully, the chill in my gut spreading cold and fast. This wasn't Jake. Not really. That night, I sat by the fire, clutching the wooden relic we'd found. It was heavier than I remembered, and cold to the touch despite the flames. The carved spiral seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive beneath the charred surface. A thin film of moisture gathered on the bag holding it, shimmering in the firelight. When I touched it, I felt a subtle vibration, like the relic was resisting. Later, in the shifting shadows beyond the firelight, I found a second piece of wood, charred and splintered, half buried beneath a collapsed stone slab. It matched the first fragment, as if torn from the same totem or post. Together, they felt like broken promises, silent witnesses to something old and bitter. I pulled out the notebooks from the Cherokee elders that had visited the site. Their warnings now echoed in my mind, the tale of the cold voice, a spirit that stole the voices of the living and the dead alike, whispering in the trees to lure wanderers into the dark. One passage described a time when a thriving people had been slaughtered in war, their sacred ground defiled. From the desecration, a malevolent force was born, a voice without origin, a shadow without form. I lay awake, knife in hand, the fire sputtering low as the wind howled outside. The forest fell utterly quiet, no bird calls echoed, no leaves stirred, and the fog settled heavy and close, wrapping the tent like a cold, damp shroud. I heard whispers, soft, beckoning, carried just beyond the edges of hearing. Each time I reached to look, the sound vanished. Sleep did not come easily. I set up simple alarms around the perimeter, tripwires strung with bells, flares ready to ignite, but when I checked them, all were undisturbed. Whatever was out there was clever, patient. My journal entries grew erratic, the neat lines blurring into frantic scrawlings. I tried to anchor myself in facts, but the creeping dread gnawed at my thoughts, threatening to unravel reason. Outside, the storm raged on, relentless and unforgiving. The forest had become a cage, and whatever haunted it was no longer just watching, it was waiting. Part 4. Creature stalks, fight at base, and chase to ritual site. The storm had swallowed the last light hours ago, turning the forest into a dark, wet maze where every tree and stone seemed to lean in, pressing close. Rain hammered the canvas of my tent with relentless fury, drumming an uneven rhythm that masked most other sounds. But beneath the rain's roar, I caught something else, something quieter, insidious. The silence around me was absolute. No animals calling, no wind stirring leaves, no insects buzzing. Just an empty hush that felt heavier than the storm. I sat on the thin foam pad inside my tent, clutching the small carved wooden idol I'd found days earlier, a fragile piece no larger than my palm. It was weathered, its spiraling designs worn smooth, but something about it called to me, a connection I didn't yet understand. I had carried it with me ever since, a talisman against the dark. The radio was dead, as useless as the GPS tracker. Jake was out in the storm, miles away, trying to get the car running again after the alternator had finally given up. That left me alone in this godforsaken place, with nothing but my thoughts and the growing sense that I was being watched. Then came the voice. It was soft, almost drowned by the storm, but distinct. Not the familiar sarcasm of Jake, but something fractured, twisted. A garbled whisper, calling my name. Alex! It seeped through the thin walls of the tent, uneven, broken, and not quite human. I froze, heart thudding. I didn't answer. The voice repeated, this time mixed with other sounds, cracks, croaks, and what might have been laughter, but warped and cracked. My fingers tightened around the wooden idol. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath. I heard a faint scraping, branches bending under weight, wet leaves crunching softly. Then the shadow moved. Just beyond the glow of the dying campfire, something shifted in the fog. A twisted shape, limbs too long, fingers crooked and gnarled like old roots. The thing wasn't entirely flesh. Patches of bark, moss, and cracked skin modeled its form. The creature lingered at the edge of the campfire's flickering glow, its twisted limbs shifting almost imperceptibly as it studied me. Its hollow eyes, dark pits rimmed with cracked bark, locked onto mine, unblinking and cold, like ancient roots twisting patiently beneath the earth, waiting to strangle. The air between us thickened, charged with a silent menace that pressed down harder than the storm. Its voice came again, fractured and distant. You left alone. I grabbed my torch, striking flint until the flame sputtered to life, the fire a shaky glow against the relentless rain. The creature flinched as the light hit it, but didn't retreat. Its ragged, mismatched face contorted briefly, flashing a semblance of Jake's grin, unfinished, mouth moving out of sync. I held up the small idol. It pulsed faintly, as if alive, and for a moment, the creature recoiled. Then it lunged. The struggle was fierce and raw. Its cold, sinewy hands clawed at my jacket, fingers like twisted vines trying to snare me. I jabbed with a broken branch, shards digging into its mottled skin. The creature hissed, a wet, rasping sound that seemed to echo with dozens of voices layered together. I threw burning embers toward it. The flames hissed and sparked as they struck its mottled skin, licking the twisted bark and raw flesh with searing heat. Smoke curled upward, carrying the scent of charred wood and damp earth, but the creature barely flinched, only emitting a rasping, inhuman hiss that echoed like broken glass. In the chaos, the wooden idol slipped from my grasp. It skittered across the wet dirt, catching a spark from the torch and smoldering. The creature's reaction was immediate and violent, a twisted scream, a surge of agony and rage that rippled through the night. It swiped the burning idol, clutching it to its chest as the flames licked its warped flesh. Its form flickered wildly, limbs twitching uncontrollably, voices breaking apart into a harsh, jumbled roar. The fire seemed to burn deeper than wood, tearing through something unseen as the creature howled in anguish. That reaction, raw and terrified, hit me like a punch. This small idol wasn't just a trinket. It was a link, a tether to something far greater. The storm was a frenzy around us, lightning fracturing the sky, thunder rolling like the ground itself was breaking apart. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled away, dodging grasping limbs and thrashing branches as the creature recovered, furious and wounded. I fled into the woods, rain slick beneath my boots, branches whipping at my face and arms. The thing pursued me relentlessly, its shape flickering like a nightmare caught between shadows and form. It tried to trap me, weaving between trees, blocking paths, snapping twigs underfoot, but I pushed harder, heart hammering in my chest. Finally, the forest opened into the clearing. The ancient burial ground lay before me, a vast, somber circle of moss-covered stones, weathered mounds, and the looming silhouette of the massive wooden relic at its center. Towering, carved with spirals and faces frozen in time, it stood like a sentinel from another age. The creature faltered at the edge of the clearing. It trembled, twisting and flickering, as if the relic's presence twisted its form with unseen chains. I didn't pause, ducking behind a half-collapsed stone shrine for breath, clutching my soaked clothes and aching ribs. Lightning cracked again, revealing the grotesque figure for a brief second before it dissolved back into the night. The storm's fury was relentless, but even in its roar, the forest seemed to hold its breath. And so did I. I stayed low behind the half-collapsed shrine, mud soaking through my knees and elbows, breath shallow and uneven. The clearing around me felt too open now, exposed and ancient and breathing with something that didn't sleep. Mist curled across the ritual site like a veil, turning familiar stones into unfamiliar shapes. The totem stood across from me, warped and massive, the old wood slick with rain and black with rot. Its carved faces caught the light strangely, dozens of gouged mouths and spirals, each one distorted, weathered, almost pulsing. I hadn't noticed before how they all seemed to turn inward, toward the base, as if drawn to whatever had been buried there. In my hand I still held the small charred idol, the fragment I'd picked up days ago without thought, now cracked and warm from the flare blast at camp. It wasn't the relic itself. Just a splinter. A piece of something much larger. The thing had flinched at its presence. Had drawn back when I touched it. That reaction, it meant something. It meant the larger totem mattered even more. I shifted slowly, careful not to scrape against the stones, and scanned the mist ahead. At first, nothing moved. Just the quiet of the rain and the creak of wind through the trees. Then, low to the ground, something slid between the burial mounds, limbs too long, body dragging, moving slow like it was listening. It circled the outer edge of the clearing. I caught the shifting shape of its hunched back beneath the mist, sometimes rising tall, sometimes dropping low, always twitching. I stayed still, barely breathing, watching as it passed close enough to brush the edge of one of the old stone rings with its hand. That wasn't curiosity, it was possession. It belonged here. Or thought it did. Then it stopped. Its head turned slowly, jerking like a broken doll, and I felt the weight of its attention without seeing its face. Not full recognition yet, just awareness. Maybe it heard my breath. Maybe the rain tapping on my coat. I shrank deeper behind the rubble, fingers tightening on the flare gun. My other hand clutched the soaked backpack against my chest, knowing the last flare was buried somewhere inside beneath plastic and metal. The thing moved again. A step forward. Another. Then it broke into a lurching sprint, straight toward the shrine. I bolted. My foot slipped as I lunged out of cover, and the creature's arm swiped past me, raking through the space I'd just vacated. I scrambled over the stones, legs churning, mud flying. Behind me, the sound of its chase was wet and close, footsteps mismatched like hooves or something heavier. No time to think. I just ran. The clearing narrowed near the totem's base, and I threw myself behind one of the broken ceremonial platforms, half stone, half rotted wood, and dove toward the pack. My hands fumbled blindly for the flare gun nestled within. The creature crashed into the other side of the structure, claws scraping over the surface, gouging deep lines into the lichen-crusted wood. My fingers closed on the grip. I rolled out from cover and fired. The flare hit low, right at the totem's base. For a moment, the flames flickered, as if struggling to take hold. Then, fueled by the dry wood and some hidden resin, the fire roared to life. It raced upward in a spiral, licking the carved faces with hungry tongues, twisting the ancient wood into a blazing pillar of heat and smoke. The creature recoiled, stumbling back from the sudden blaze. Its body writhed in pain, limbs bending at unnatural angles, posture collapsing inward. Its scream shattered the night, a harsh, layered cry that seemed to split into many voices at once, broken and raw. I stepped closer to the flames, holding the small relic out before me. It pulsed with a fierce heat. The creature's gaze locked on it, flickering with recognition, no, not memory, but a deep, agonized connection born of something older than time. Then, suddenly, it surged forward, its scream turning into a feral roar, and attacked the fire itself, slamming its claws against the burning totem's base. It tried desperately to tear the flames away, to smother them, but the fire only fed stronger. The wood cracked and split under the heat, releasing ancient spirals and faces, distorted in agony and betrayal. Its body writhed, cracked, and began to unravel, not flesh melting, but like bark peeling from a dead tree. Limbs collapsed inward. The torso twisted, splitting apart. No blood flowed, only ash and smoke. With one last agonized howl, it staggered, claws scraping the earth as it collapsed forward. The ground beneath it trembled, cracked, and slowly began to swallow the creature whole. Its blackened, twisted form sank inch by agonizing inch into the soil, as if the mountain itself was pulling it back into the depths. Even as it disappeared, its ragged hands reached out, clawing at the dirt, silent screams echoing in the cool night air. The fire blazed higher, consuming the totem entirely. Smoke and ash spiraled into the mist, swirling through the ancient stones and burial mounds. The storm overhead finally eased, but the tension in the air remained thick, unbroken. I dropped the small relic, now cracked and blackened, letting it crumble to dust beside the scorched stones. My breath came harsh and ragged, the chills settling into my bones as I stepped back from the dying firelight. Near the base of a broken stone marker, something caught my eye, Jake's scarf, torn and mud-caked, half buried in the runoff. I knelt, picking it up carefully. The fabric was soaked and frayed, the knots still tight where he tied it in the cold. I didn't look back toward the smoldering totem or the earth that had swallowed the creature. I just stood there, holding the last piece of my friend, as the night closed around me. The mountain held its silence. The darkness still lingered. The mountain remained, silent and watchful, its presence heavy and unyielding as ever. My body was battered, muscles stiff and trembling, scraped and bruised, and the cold settled deep into my bones. The rain had finally ceased, but the air was heavy and thick, saturated with the smell of wet stone, burnt wood, and the earthy scent of disturbed soil. The ground where the creature had collapsed was a scarred crater, blackened and cracked, as if the land itself bore a wound that wouldn't heal. A faint, unsettling vibration hummed beneath my fingers when I rested my palm near the ashes, subtle and persistent, a reminder that something was not fully at rest. I drew a ragged inhale, the wetness on my skin mingling with sweat, and forced myself to stand. Every movement was a reminder of the struggle, the desperate chase through twisted roots, the sharp edge of slate biting into my leg, the creature's hot breath just missing as it lunged. The flare gun, the burning torch, small weapons against a nightmare with roots older than memory, had saved my life, but the cost echoed through every bone in my body. I thought of Jake. The guilt sat behind everything else. He'd walked out into the storm, cracked a joke about jumper cables, and never came back. There hadn't even been a scream, just silence, followed by something wearing his voice. It wasn't fair. And it wasn't over. I turned my back on the crater and hobbled down toward the base of the trail, where the rescue team's lights had finally pushed through the fog. Their headlights lit the tree trunks like pillars. Radios crackled. Boots stamped. Nobody said much. Just glances, quiet tension, and the sense that whatever had happened here, no one really wanted to ask. When someone finally approached to ask about Jake, I didn't say much. Just that he didn't make it. There wasn't language for the rest of it. After hours of restless waiting, as the rescue team finally loaded supplies and prepared to leave the site, a small group approached from the tree line. Their movements were slow and deliberate, local elders, their faces weathered but calm. They didn't speak at first, simply watching as I packed up my things. One stepped forward, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth, wild herbs, a carved wooden bead, and a feather, simple but meaningful. Without a word, they placed it gently on the ground near my gear, then gave a slight nod of respect. It wasn't a ceremony or a performance, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had been done here, of the balance restored, and the spirits appeased. Their eyes met mine for a moment, heavy with a shared understanding that words couldn't capture. Then, as silently as they came, they turned back toward the forest, leaving me with the fragile gift and a lingering sense of connection deeper than any spoken thanks. In the days that followed, I found no peace in idle rest. I returned to the site under fading light, carrying a bundle of carefully wrapped bones, pottery shards, and fragments we had disturbed. The soil was soft, the rain having soaked deep, and I dug slowly, reverently, placing each piece back beneath the earth. The stones, the earth, the history, it felt sacred now, not just to those who had come before, but to me as well. The woods were quiet. No birds sang. No rustling stirred the branches. The stillness was a fragile veil, holding back something I dared not provoke. The silence pressed in on me, filled with memories and half-heard whispers. Night was the hardest. Sleep came only in restless shards, haunted by flickers of shifting shadows and broken voices, fragments of words, laughter, and cries from a distant past. I kept my journal close, writing by candlelight, documenting everything, trying to hold on to reality as the borders between history, myth, and nightmare blurred. Sometimes, when the wind moved through the trees just so, I caught faint whispers, my name, or Jake's, carried on the breath of the forest. I refused to turn. Some calls were traps, and the woods had long memories. I eventually made it into town and left my notes, everything I had documented, at the steps of the local historical society in an unlabeled envelope. Not a cry for attention. Just a record, preserved anonymously. I don't want anyone going back there, not without knowing what lies beneath the moss and roots. The elders' words echoed in my mind, you carry their story now. Carrying it meant a burden and a responsibility. I had stepped into a long shadow, a tale of a once peaceful people, their lives shattered by an evil they never invited. The ancient ground, defiled and twisted by something unnatural, had lashed out because it had been disturbed. But now, with fire and earth, something had shifted again. But the mountain remained. And it was still watching.